Hello, hello. Good morning, all. Welcome to episode number seven of Eat NATO for Breakfast. We have about 3 months to go until the NATO summit in Madrid. We've seen our sort of original agenda of mobilizing for a protest and a counter summit upended by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We've discussed it here on the show too. The alliances against NATO that the peace movement had built in Europe, alliances with the growing environmental movement, recognizing the relation between war and destruction of the planet, with anti-racist activists who protest the militarization of police forces in the cities, and also civil society recognizing that military budgets are related to austerity. All of these have been strained by this war in the Ukraine, and suddenly we see a lot more than we anticipated support for militarization and increased budgets, for delivery of weapons, for excluding Russia and all Russians from society and the world community. That's why we're talking today about borders, migration, racism, and refugees with two very special guests. Right, Nora?
Yes, because in Eat NATO for Breakfast, we want to unfold what lies behind today's context in NATO. In the show, we have looked at the history of NATO. We had guests exposing the mechanisms by which the new Cold War in China is being waged. We took a feminist lens to peace and war politics, and we are also tasked to view the Ukrainian conflict in all its complexities, while at the same time acting compassionately towards all the refugees created by the inevitable wars of imperial geopolitical relations. And today, we need to take a hard look at European hypocrisy in its treatment of migrants and refugees. We are honored to have as guests today Sarah Rieder and Carrie Hu from Abolish Frontex. How are you? Where are you? And what are you having for breakfast? I just finished my first bunch of Madrid churros.
Hi, everyone. I'm Carrie. I'm usually based in Brussels, but I actually grew up in Suffolk, Australia, which is where I am today. It is 9 p.m. here, so I'm not having breakfast. I am having a tea with my beautiful mug today. And I work in the racial justice space, as well as volunteering with Abolish Frontex. Before I actually want to speak today, I do want to just do acknowledgement to country and acknowledge the traditional owners that I'm of land that I'm speaking on today, which is the Wallumedegal people. Because as we speak about NATO and military, I just think it's so important to recognize how violence imposed by empire is just continuous today. Over here, it's the oppression and occupation of Aboriginal people. And yeah, sovereignty in this country known as Australia was never ceded. This always will be Aboriginal land.
Great. And I'm Sarah, and I'm based here in Brussels. And I work for a small anti-militarist organisation called Agir pour la Paix. And we've been really involved in sort of helping to build and launch the Abolish Frontex campaign that we're going to be looking at today. And yeah, it's really great to see how much organising and mobilising is going into the NATO summit, because we have one here next week actually. So it's very inspiring to see how much you're doing in the run up to it.
Sarah, what are you having for breakfast? That's so cool.
Oh, I haven't had breakfast. Yeah. I've got a really good cup of coffee with a homemade mug my friend sent to me. But I prioritize going for a walk with my dog instead of having breakfast this morning.
Nice. We are so glad to have you here with us today. So important to connect all of our efforts against NATO and to hear, to exchange, and to think together with allies, organizers, and to expand our look of the NATO alliance as well, and what war means to the people who suffer their wars. In fact, today we have our open online meeting at 3 p.m. CET time to precisely have an international space to think together, to build strategy and common work towards the next NATO summit in Madrid. So we hope to see you all there. We will paste the registration link in case you miss it.
Cool. Thank you, Nora. Welcome, Carrie and Sarah. Thank you for also mentioning the Australian, like the Aboriginal, the ceding of land, etc., etc. I think another aspect that we need to talk about and will be talking about in this show later down the road is that even though we are really like war makes people react and act in maybe crazy ways, we need to recognize that violence is something that is part of the sort of capitalist imperial landscape long before an actual war breaks out. And many of the refugees or of the migrants that come to European borders are not necessarily just fleeing the crazy war that is happening currently in Ukraine or that has been going on in Yemen or et cetera, but there's lots of reasons why people are on the move.
Absolutely.
So for people who paid attention in the recent days, there have been, of course, some really actually horrific stories of the racist treatment of refugees at the Polish-Ukrainian border. And of course, also at the same time, we've had this in Berlin and in many other European places, an outpouring of solidarity for refugees from Ukraine. Of course, we see people who have been watching know that this new crisis comes on top of the last crisis, and is in any case just sort of the tip of the iceberg of an ever increasing number of people in the world being on the move. And it seems that the route to Europe has become ever more deadly. The militarized policies of the Fortress Europe have killed over 440,000 people since 1993. They drowned in the Mediterranean, they were shot at the borders. There is, which probably Abolish Frontex also works on and knows a lot about, death by suicide at detention centers, tortured and killed after being deported. Of course, we see all these deaths are avoidable. Many of these people were obliged to leave their homes for political reasons, for climate, health, economic reasons. And for the most part, the EU and NATO and its actions have actually played a part in the cause for these people to leave their original countries. So we export wars and we expand the defense of our borders. We kill the people who survive those wars, and the ones that reach us, we detain, deport, and exclude. And in the midst of all this, somehow sits Frontex. So it sounds innocuous enough. European Border and Coast Guard Agency sounds like, I don't know, sounds like a lifeguard almost, watching the beach while you swim.
Yeah, some hot beach babes trying to come save you.
Yes, that's almost what it sounds like. We know that isn't the case, but I think it would be really important for also especially people who may not be in Europe and who have not seen headlines around Frontex to explain a little bit more what is Frontex, who are they, what do they actually do, and of course, something that we always need to ask ourselves, who needs it? What is it used for? So please, Carrie and Sarah, take it away and fill us in on some of the basics so that we then have a better sense of where to go from there.
That was such a great summary, Fran. Absolutely. Frontex isn't just like a benign Coast Guard. Frontex is the EU's border agency, and it's like such a key factor in enforcing the EU's incredibly racist, incredibly colonial, and most importantly, a militarized border regime. It did start like 20 years ago as like this small agency in Poland, but it's like very quickly become one of the most powerful EU agencies. It's got 5.6 billion euros reserved from 2021 to 2027. It's like overseen by the European Commission, although the European Commission likes to really distance itself from Frontex because a lot of the time it acts like a very rogue agency with like really little transparency and accountability. And yeah, it's been really interesting. The agency has increasingly been able to buy its own military equipment, ships, helicopters, drones, and it really like benefits armed security and surveillance companies that are really like influential in lobbying the EU because there's like a huge profit motive, right, for the EU to amp its border and defense policies and to pretty much give money to these companies. I think the most interesting thing about Frontex is that it's not just this benign sort of like Coast Guard agency. It actually aims to have an army of 10,000 armed border guards by 2027. This is like an armed border guard against people seeking asylum. So like people fleeing conflict and violence, you know, the people who we see fleeing Ukraine today. And as you've said, like absolutely a lot of the time these people are fleeing wars resultant of NATO bombing or occupation or a historical context of colonialism where Europe was one of the main drivers. I think, as you've said, within this current context, I think it's so important to like look to the fact that in the past 2 weeks, like Europe has just managed to absorb 3 million Ukrainian refugees. And we're comparing this back to 2015 and 16 when the Syrian war was at its peak, which, NATO did participate in. And around that many refugees fled to Europe, mainly Black and brown people, but they were met with, not with, mayors opening up their homes to refugees, not with a really, really positive sort of media, but with really hard borders, police, military guards, and a very, very hostile Europe. And I think this shows, like, you asked the question, like, what is the point of Frontex? Exactly. What is the point of Frontex? Europe has the capacity and the resources and capability to give safe havens to refugees escaping war. We've just seen this, but for some people, it chooses not to. And instead, generally with Black and brown refugees, it paints them as a threat rather than people in desperate need for shelters and to escape conflict and to build new homes. Sarah, I think, there's probably more that you can talk to about Frontex's more systemic human rights violations.
Yeah, thanks, Carrie. And I think it's worth coming back to the figure you mentioned of the 3 million people that Europe has really welcomed in several countries. I mean, we're seeing countries like Poland and Hungary that in the past have had really racist anti-migrant sentiment suddenly putting in place, all these mechanisms to welcome white refugees. So that's 3 million people in under a month. The 2015 and 16 so-called migrant crisis, which really kick-started this sort of ramped up militarization of Europe's borders, seeing people who move as threats that need, Europe needs to protect itself against the security threat. That was 1 million people over the course of a whole year. So I just think it's really important to, have that context and see what's behind Europe's border policies. So I think, Carrie, you painted a really good picture of why we don't need Frontex. For those who haven't heard so much about it, that was one of the main reasons we launched the campaign last year, is because we felt it is one of the most powerful agencies the EU has with the biggest budget, but not that many people know what they do and how they operate. And I think transparency is a massive, massive problem with it. So Frontex really, as Carrie was saying, it's really responsible for systemic human rights violations through basically everything it does. It is not about rescuing people at sea or ensuring safe passage. It's about supporting governments in deportations, cooperating with countries outside of the EU to stop people from trying to cross borders in the first place, and advising the EU member states on how to better, strengthen and surveil and militarize its borders. So Frontex runs border control operations throughout the Mediterranean Sea and in Balkan countries. It's, as I said, a key coordinator and enabler of deportations throughout the EU, and sort of acting as an EU returns agency. So I don't know if you saw, but in the wake of the war in Ukraine, Frontex is offering humanitarian return flights for non-Ukrainian refugees so that they can get back to their country of origin. And I think it's really another kind of really stark contrast in what we've seen on the Polish-Belarus border, is a place where people are currently, white Ukrainian refugees are being welcomed into Europe, but it's the very same place where a few months ago, Frontex Executive Director Fabrice Leggeri went to the border to congratulate Poland on how it was strengthening that part of the border and planning to build a wall and essentially trapping thousands of people and preventing them from entering the EU. So it's definitely a hostile agency. And I think one of the things about EU agencies is they like to hide behind innocuous sounding names that don't really depict the kind of deadly nature of what they actually do.
Yeah, indeed. I think that deadly nature is not like pointed out, but deviated. Like here from the Spanish perspective, we see regularly on the news people trying to come to European shores. They never speak on the news. We don't hear their voices, but the voiceover narrates how all of them are some kind of threat and that they are doing something wrong. They clearly point out that we should be afraid of them, but then we really don't know how all this process works. They rarely talk about who those policemen are or what happens with them when they arrive, in fact, to Europe. And also, not everyone knows what a migrant detention center is. And at least here in Spain, we have several ones. In fact, a few times that we hear the word Frontex, it is represented as a legitimate institution. It's like the objective arm of security of the European Union. But one question that links what you were like when you were defining Frontex, we need to think maybe if the Europe does needs any protection, because I think that's like the narrative, like we've been protected by Frontex. How do you see this?
I mean, I think that's so wild, right? I think like you've nailed it on the head of like, I just wish these European Union ministers would actually think, do we actually need protection? Like, what is actually going on? Protection from whom? Europe is one of the richest states. The EU is one of the richest sort of like, states, and has built its wealth on centuries and centuries of explicit like underdevelopment of the global south through colonialism, imperialism, violence, slavery, exploitation, oppression, exclusion. And this is like continual to this day. We very much like Europe's richness and wealth is built on like a financial system, a trade system that extracts from the global south, and as a result creates poverty or conflict or the inability for these states to develop, that then pushes people to move to places in which they can live. It continually fuels wars. We can see that instability and repression through its arms sales, supporting countries like Saudi Arabia in its war against Yemen and in Israel in its occupation of Palestine. And these military operations cause death and destructions. It destabilizes countries, communities, and like these economies. And as I've said, like looking at these unequal trade relations just continues this exploitations and exclusion to maintain and exacerbate poverty. So I really think the European Union, what is this threat that we're really being protected from? The EU is the main driver of climate change through an extractivist sort of like fossil fuel dependent economy. We are one of the biggest sort of, polluters when it comes to carbon dioxide. And, Europe likes to always talk about, we need to defend democracy, liberal democracy and human rights. But honestly, when you really look at Europe historically and objectively, it is one of the biggest exporters of human rights violations. It is the place where colonialism was created and bred. I would always like to say, I think the EU needs to intervene on itself, right? Like the people need protection from the EU and its own agenda.
I think that's a really fair point. And in fact, I was thinking about Sarah's answer before when you were talking about other conflicts. I think that also the issue of extending the borders and this idea of the European fortress, like we have to lie behind a fortress because, we have to be protected. I don't know. I saw that Abolish Frontex also works a lot with the Libyan refugees. I think that's also very well connected with NATO, and this situation of protection also can be linked to this situation. I don't know, Sarah, what do you think about this kind of narratives where we are pointing out like we need protections for those we are selling bombs to and organized an alliance, a military alliance against them?
I think it's important to say that it's not by chance that the EU has this approach, and that all of its border and defence policies are inherently militaristic. So I'm based here in Brussels, which is the second lobby capital of the world. There are over 25,000 people lobbying to influence EU policy, and 3/4 of those represent corporate interests. So all of the big industries that are driving the very problems and issues that Carrie mentioned, driving climate change, driving injustice, driving agro-industrial food system, those companies are all found here in Brussels, and they're all actively trying to shape EU policy. And so when we look at the EU defence, and I say defence in quote marks because even that is, I think, not representative of what the EU is doing, all of the world's biggest arms companies that are profiting from the funds that are made available, they are the ones who are lobbying for the EU to have this militarized response. And there's this really crude cycle where you see it's the arms companies who are not only making the weapons that are being used in wars, for example, being sold to Israel, being used against the Palestinian people, being sold to Saudi Arabia, and being used in Yemen. The same arms companies that make the weapons are then lobbying for a militarized and reinforced borders. And so they're then profiting from, the influx of people who are having to flee these wars that Europe is fueling, and sort of providing the militarized border system in place. So I think it's important to see how the EU's, border and arms or war machine is inherently linked with corporate interests.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a very important point that we always have to keep in mind, and that sometimes gets lost. That there's corporate interests at work. That there's economy and profits that need to be kept alive and need to be generated, and that sometimes it's still. Yeah, given these profit motives, etc., I still feel that it is not quite explaining the extremely different treatment of the Ukrainian refugees. And as you've pointed out, like the ability of the EU to open its arms wide and welcome. And I mean, I don't think that any of us argues that Ukrainian refugees shouldn't be treated as warmly and with that much solidarity. But the question has to be why we cannot extend that to all people on the move from all different wars. So what is the role of racism in this? Is it cause or effect? Is it, just being exploited as a tool to justify this or that? What is the Polish Wall, for example? Or how does that relate to like the racism? How does that relate to also a growing fear of a rising right in Europe, in different European countries? How does that relate to fascism? And then again, of course, our connection to war. We see people fleeing from war all the time. How do we explain the different treatment beyond just saying, yeah, sure, like white people, brown people? That seems a little, I don't know, it seems a little bit of a vulgar explanation. And I think we need to discuss the racism a bit more deeply and a bit more, analyze it a bit better to understand how to also address it, and how to not only, how to talk to our own comrades and our own people without being told, yeah, you just don't care about Ukrainian refugees. Why do you even bring this up, etc., etc. We need a better understanding of this and what is really happening on this particular border at the moment. So what can the Ukraine actually show us beyond the capacity of Europe to take refugees in? What else can the actual situation show us and help us to discuss and analyze around these border regimes and the racism that is inherent in them?
Yeah, absolutely. It's so racist, can I just say? Like, it is, I think, yeah, I've actually been in a lot of despair recently when I actually really think of how racist this system of migration has been. And I think one of the things that has really shown it was, I was just like doom scrolling late at night recently, just reading these horrific stories coming out of like Black and brown. I work in like the racial justice space, and there've been so many Black and African refugees and people organizing Black and brown people who are in Ukraine to leave, because even within that system, it's not just, or anyone who's Ukraine is allowed to leave. There are all these like really horrific stories of like Black and brown people leaving Ukraine being literally pushed to the back of the line, right? Like pushed to the back of the line. And that entirely highlights how the way in which we approach seeking asylum, the way in which we approach people in the move, and the way that we've actually created war and like a war propaganda is incredibly racialized. And as to whether or not racism is the cause or effect of this policy, like the way that I like to think of that is always drawing it back to the material causes of war. Because fundamentally, all of these societies, particularly capitalist societies, go to war and participate in imperialism in order to protect their like material interests. And race has always been a means to justify colonialism, propaganda, and a way to dehumanize, a class of people, to exploit their labor, to use them as a boogeyman or as an enemy for profit. And then it becomes a bit of like a self-fulfilling prophecy, where these racist myths are created to justify war and exploitation, which leads to some form of violent backlash or as a result of poverty and oppression that then reinforces even stricter sort of racist policies. The way that I like to reflect on it a lot is as within my own experiences. I'm not a refugee, but I'm a child of migrants, right? Like my family migrated from China to Australia. And one of the things that is so part of the narrative when I was growing up was how thankful I should be that I'm in Australia, how beautiful it is that I got to be in like a rich, civilized place like Australia. And I used to really like eat this narrative up. And it wasn't until the older I get when I started understanding my own the own history of like my people in China, why it was that my parents felt that they had to leave a country where they had all their families, their friends, their culture, why I had to lose that growing up in a Western society is completely the result of war, right? Like 200 years of warfare against a place like China. And it really shows that this entire system is not just enough to look at it in terms of a racialized lens or in terms of racism. It's really showing how racism sort of like exists within our society because of this systemic sort of like this systemic inequality and sort of like exploitation of another country in which our country completely profits and benefits from. And the people who then become the victims of this tend to be racialized people from these poor countries where people in elite positions of power has to continually justify the dehumanization and the exploitation of. And yeah, it sometimes leads me to a lot of despair because people don't really see this link, and they don't always see this link, even in the racial justice space. They don't see how war and imperialism is actually what leads to so much of this racism. We can see this, with the war on terror and the growing Islamophobia. We can see this with anti-Asian hate when it comes to the growing war on China. And we can even see this with the targeting of Russian people as a result of this war. Like, this is something that we were talking about this beforehand, Fran, where you were saying that there was a school of Russian kids who people had burnt down their primary school. And it's stuff like this which shows how emotional war is, and that emotionality of war tends to be proliferated and propagated in a way that really dehumanizes a set of people in order to justify this continuous militarization. And yeah, I really despair whenever I think about this.
Yeah, and I think going back to this kind of building of walls in Europe. So there is, I think it's useful just to say there is a precedent for regularizing migrants in Europe. So before the decision that the EU has taken now to give Ukrainian refugees 3 years rights to stay in the EU and to work and benefit from the public services, the vast majority of EU member states have in the past regularized migrants. But I think a key thing is that this regularization, it's not driven by humanitarian or goodwill policies. It's driven by economic, trade, or political motives. And the fact that the European economy is very much dependent on precarious, unregulated, and migrant labor. So I think, again, sort of what we're seeing in the last month is a departure from the EU's approach to migration, and it just really clearly shows that European governments are making a choice by refusing to legalize people without papers, and that choice is deeply racist, and it's racist and colonial, and there's no two ways about it. Franti, you asked about the Polish wall. So actually, since the 1990s, EU member states and in the Schengen area, they've built nearly 1,000 kilometers of border walls. So these are to prevent displaced people from coming into Europe. And these physical walls that are being constructed, including at the Polish border, are accompanied by even longer maritime walls in the sea, and naval operations patrolling the Mediterranean, and other sort of border control systems, surveillance systems to stop people from coming into Europe. And, at what point did the European Peace Project become a sort of a defense of Fortress Europe and a war machine? I think is a really big question. So yeah, Poland, which is kind of honestly, the contrast is despairing between what we're seeing now and what we saw at the end of last year. But Poland itself is in the process of building a border wall, which will measure over 180 kilometers, and I think up to around 5 or 6 meters tall. Also equipped with motion detectors and thermal cameras. And this also comes with increased militarization. So just less than 6 months ago, Poland actually declared a state of emergency at its border with Belarus, because when thousands of people were trying to cross the border and became trapped in this zone, that because of the state of emergency, health workers, aid workers, journalists were not allowed anywhere near the border. And this was it was October, November. I don't know if you followed in the news reports, but freezing weather conditions with no food, no medical attention. And these were mainly people from countries like Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, Kurdish folk, Cameroon, Congo, and this is the same. I mean, it's the same border area that is now people are being greeted with cuddly toys for the children, and hot mugs of tea, and these stories of how welcoming the country is. And it's obviously that we don't want that not to happen for the people who are fleeing Ukraine, but that's how all people should be welcomed into Europe. People should be allowed, every person should be allowed to move and live. And just really the stark contrast of how this is happening is it's despairing. It's
fucked.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah, it is frightening, and it is despairing, and I can only echo. I mean, hearing and seeing a lot of that information at the end of last year, and this continues on not only there, but on every border. Like we mentioned numbers earlier of how many people actually die in the Mediterranean while they try to cross over. I think Nora was telling me just, I don't know, 3 days ago or something, when again another group of refugees died in the Mediterranean, and that doesn't even make the news anymore. So these types of things are incredibly horrific. We want to draw this show though to a close and try to be a little more optimistic, a little more. Obviously we need to fight for something, as does Abolish Frontex. Your main demand is the call for safe migration routes for all, and not just in times of crisis. I think, Sarah, you just echoed that by describing what the situation is in the borderlands around Poland. My question is twofold. Like, first of all, what else would it take for the activists of Abolish Frontex to actually abolish Frontex? It's a word that I really like. This is why I wanted to say it 3 times in a row. So what are the demands? What are the key points that would make the activists who work in Abolish Frontex to actually feel we are on a better track we are doing something useful, or or Europe is becoming a partner in this, or is actually being keeping its promises. Let's put it this way. So what's the organization's long game, sort of from the urgent of helping right now to prevent death to actually the important, where do we want to be? And I also want to ask you to share with us, because I feel that we have touched upon some of these topics now, but I think it's always too short. And I think that some of it, we know already that we can't entirely rely on just the mainstream media to dig deep into the causes of this, the causes of why we have refugees at the borders, as almost never discussed. Again, Nora mentioned it. We don't hear the voices of why people leave or what, So I would like for you two to maybe share with us some resources, some of it that Abolish Frontex does, but quite frankly, also some, books that informed you on the topic, or like resources that you would like to share. Here we can provide the links in the public comments to stuff like that. We really feel that this show with its like 30 minutes can only be sort of the beginning. And then we really like to take the opportunity to share what would be the next step if you want to go down this journey and learn more about it. So talk more about the Abolish Frontex work, and then share with us all the resources that got you to this point of being active in this group. Thank you.
Great. It's always good to talk about what can we actually do about this after spending 30 minutes outlining everything that's horrifically wrong. So Frontex is the tip of the iceberg, and the idea of the campaign was really to use it to amplify and coordinate existing movements that have been around for years, and to give people wherever they are the tools and ideas to take action, because we know, it is despairing, and the only way we're gonna get anywhere is by organizing and fighting back. So with the Abolish Frontex campaign, it's the choice of abolition was a clear political one, because it's not about improving the existing system. We don't want to better monitor pushbacks. We want pushbacks to stop. We don't want to make deportation flights safer. We want deportations to stop. So it's really about trying to show how these different issues are connected and what people can do. So there's, as well as I think revisiting, security, like what is the world we want to be living in, and I think one of the key things people can do is actually take action. So we have 2 days of action coming up on the 22nd and the 24th of April. And this was chosen because, I don't know if people have heard, but in Switzerland, over 50,000 people actually signed a petition to get the government to cut its ties with Frontex. So after the government announced that it would be contributing, I think, 60 million Swiss francs to Frontex, activists organized and managed to get a referendum, which will be taking place in May. And this, if successful, not only would Switzerland stop giving financial contributions to Frontex, but it could actually, pull back from Frontex completely. So I think this is a really exciting moment, which could set a precedent for groups in other EU countries to actually put pressure on their governments to stop financially supporting Frontex or supplying it with equipment. So the day of action at the end of April is a few weeks before the referendum to amplify that, but it's also on the anniversary of when 130 people drowned in the Mediterranean, despite alarm phone calling authorities for help for over 10 hours and a Frontex plane flying over and surveilling them. So it's a really important sort of marker of that anniversary, which again shows the EU's hypocrisy when it comes to migration. Carrie, I don't know if you want to jump in what folks can do.
I think you've summarized it in a great way, Sarah. I will say that personally, when I had heard about the Abolish Frontex campaign, I immediately just wanted to jump in and organize with them. And what is so awesome about Abolish Frontex is that it is a decentralized campaign. people work out what strategy they think they have power over and they can work. It could be within your local university about, organizing your own like refugee welcome center. It could be organizing at a more national level about creating a campaign to, have your government step away from Frontex. It could be at an EU level. So really it is up to you. Like one of the first actions that I took was bringing a bunch of friends together to literally create, having a little bit of like an art session and creating posters together, which is now used by a lot of other organizers with Abolish Frontex, and bringing a bit of creativity and joy of, of actually coming together and working out with your own sort of like skills on seeing what you can do to oppose such a honestly evil organization. There's like no other way in which I can sugarcoat that. But within your own means. And I think that's what actually makes Abolish Frontex quite powerful, because we have a long-term vision and it is decentralized. So people can actually work out what they think within their means that they can do, which is quite empowering.
And I think so the campaign launched in June last year, and I think over 115 groups from different countries in and outside the EU have joined. So we have a website, which is hopefully being shared, which also exists in French and I think Italian. And really the idea was to have a strong sort of political foundation that, as Carrie says, groups can take on and organize in that area. And that sort of part of that is getting involved with groups and movements that have existed for generations. I think all of us have campaigns against detention centers, against forced deportations, active solidarity, hosting migrants in our countries. So yeah, hopefully there will be some tools of how to get involved.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much.
And in terms of, I just wanted that last question on like resources to start you down this, because I think I've really started becoming more and more interested in the peace movement, honestly, in the last year and a half. So I feel as if I'm very new to this movement. And the two books that I can really recommend is first, Vladimir Lenin, who is my favorite writer of all time, on how imperialism is a higher stage of capitalism, which will actually really give you a deeper context about why countries go to war in a way that isn't so emotional or based on national interest. It's really looking at that capitalist lens. And then I think the second most important text that kind of built upon that was Walter Rodney's text, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, which is so fundamental to understanding why the Global South is underdeveloped and why people from the Global South go on the move, and is, something that is very, very intentionally developed by places like Europe, the US, and the Global North. So those are the two books that I would really recommend to read to get you started down this path. It's not a great path. You kind of feel a bit crazy when you start getting into it, but it's so important to learn about.
Thank you so much. I think like this conversation just began. I think on the show, we need to go deep in these questions on how Europe is related to wars, to migration, and all to this context of what lies behind the war, in fact, of geopolitics. I think, at least for me as a Spanish person, I would like to develop all these thoughts. We have still to talk about what happens inside Europe within the social situation that we live with migration. Sarah, you were talking about anniversaries. I just wanted to remember Mamen Valle, that it was a street seller that was killed by police brutality here in Madrid in March. And also the anniversary in February of the Tarajal massacre, 15 persons killed, almost reaching Ceuta. Very, very, very horrible. There are symbols of how we relate to violence while we say we defend democracy and freedom. We need to continue talking also about migration, because today we are talking about, for sure, the context of the Ukraine war. So we are talking about the eastern border. I know that we are preparing an amazing amazing Eat NATO for Breakfast show on the South relations with the North African comrades, talking about Libya, talking about the Maghreb region. So we are going to continue talking about all these important things. We are almost reaching 45 minutes. It's been really, really, really amazing talking to you. We've been learning a lot. So thank you very much, Sara and Carrie, for sharing with us all these obscure mechanisms, very complicated, but very simple to understand politically when you have this map on how also Europe works as a history of colonialism and imperialism. And also for sure to show how war and NATO are connected with the Fortress Europe project. If you want more today about racism and fascism in Europe and how all is this connected with our context, we recommend you to participate, because also we also make recommendations on this show. The conference No Pasarán, Stop the Far Right, Building the Alternative, by our friends of the European Left and Transform Europe. We will paste the link on the chat. And also, if you are busy today with our open online meeting at 3 p.m., we also recommend to join the next International People's Assembly course. It's a 3-session course, live stream, called NATO versus Peace, that gets to the key questions of our current moment and the roots of the conflict in Ukraine. We will be also pasting the link. So thank you all. Let's fight NATO. Let's abolish Frontex, abolish racism, fascism, and let's give peace a chance. So thank to also our friends at People's Dispatch for this space, also to Suranja, our amazing producer. So see you next Saturday.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much. It was awesome. Thank
Thank
you.
you so much.
Frontex.
Ciao.